In the winter of 1975, Grand Junction, Colorado, looked like the kind of place where life moved slowly. A city surrounded by mountains, open land, and long, quiet roads. A place where families knew each other, where people believed danger lived somewhere else, in bigger cities, in darker headlines, in places far away. But that year, Grand Junction was changing. Fear had started to settle over the city like winter fog. There had been violent attacks. There had been unsolved crimes. People whispered about strangers. Parents watched their children more closely. Doors were locked earlier. Windows were checked twice. And then, just 2 days after Christmas, a 19-year-old college student walked back into her apartment and never walked out alive. Her name was Deborah Kathleen Tomlinson. Everyone called her Debbie. Debbie was born on June 11, 1956. She grew up in a close family with her parents, Jim and Dora Tomlinson, and her siblings. The Tomlinson family had known loss before. Debbie's little sister, Kathy, had died as a newborn. It was the kind of tragedy that leaves a permanent silence in a family. But despite that pain, Debbie's childhood was remembered as warm, lively, and full of love. She grew up on a ranch, surrounded by animals, open land, and work that made her strong. Debbie loved the outdoors. She loved horses. She loved the life that came with dirt roads, open skies, and animals that needed patience. There was one horse on the ranch that most people struggled with. It was difficult, restless, and hard to calm. But not with Debbie. With Debbie, the horse softened. That small detail tells you something about who she was. She had a way of making frightened things feel safe. She was outgoing, independent, and intelligent. Her father described her as someone with a mind of her own. Her siblings remembered her as caring, helpful, and protective. Debbie was not someone who disappeared into the background. She had presence. She had plans. After high school, she enrolled at Mesa College in Colorado. She wanted independence, but she did not want to leave her family too far behind. So she stayed close, living in Grand Junction in a small apartment near campus. It was her first real step into adulthood. Her own space, her own routine, her own future. The apartment was on Balfour Avenue, inside a complex where other residents lived close by. Debbie lived alone on the ground floor. To most people, it was ordinary. A young student, a small apartment, a life beginning. But that apartment would soon become the center of a mystery that would haunt her family for more than 4 decades. Christmas came in 1975. Debbie left her apartment and went back home to spend the holidays with her family. For a few days, everything was normal. There was family, food, gifts, laughter, and the quiet comfort of being home. No one knew those moments were becoming final memories. On December 27th, Debbie packed her things and prepared to return to Grand Junction. She said goodbye to her family. She carried her belongings, including a new winter vest she had received as a gift. It was cold outside. A normal winter day. A normal goodbye. But for Debbie's family, it would become the last time they ever saw her alive. Debbie returned to her apartment that afternoon. At around 2:30 p.m., she called home. Her younger brother, Jim Jr., answered the phone. Debbie told him she had arrived safely. It was a simple call, the kind families make without thinking, the kind that feels ordinary until it becomes the final conversation. Before hanging up, Debbie told him she loved him. Those were the last words her family heard from her. "I love you." After that, the apartment went silent, and somewhere inside that silence, something terrible was waiting. Later that evening, residents near Debbie's apartment noticed something strange. One of her windows was wide open. The screen had been removed or pushed aside. It was December in Colorado. The air was freezing. Nobody would leave a window open like that unless something was wrong. The neighbors contacted the apartment manager. The manager walked to Debbie's ground floor apartment and looked through the open window. She called out. No answer. Only silence. She used her master key and opened the door. Inside, at first, nothing seemed violently disturbed in the living room. No obvious robbery, no immediate chaos. But as she moved deeper into the apartment, toward the bathroom, the feeling changed. Then she opened the bathroom door and saw Debbie. The 19-year-old student was lying dead in the bathtub. The manager ran from the apartment in horror and called police. Within minutes, officers arrived. Debbie's apartment became a crime scene. The quiet building on Balfour Avenue became a place of flashing lights, police tape, and questions no one could answer. Who had done this? How had they gotten inside? And why had they chosen Debbie? The first clues were disturbing. Debbie had been attacked violently. Investigators believed the assault began in her bedroom. There was blood on the bed, on the carpet, and signs of a brutal struggle. Debbie had fought for her life. A trail of blood led from the bedroom to the bathroom, where her body had been placed in the bathtub. Nothing valuable appeared to be stolen. This did not look like a robbery gone wrong. This looked personal, or predatory. The open window suggested the killer may have entered through it after removing the screen. The attacker may have been hiding inside when Debbie returned home, or he may have entered shortly after. Either way, police knew one thing. Debbie had come home safely. She had made that phone call. Then, within a short period of time, her life was taken. The apartment held one more strange clue: a pair of men's sunglasses. Dark lenses. They did not belong to Debbie. No one close to her recognized them. The sunglasses sat there like a silent signature, a small object left behind by someone who had entered Debbie's life for only minutes and destroyed everything. At first, the case seemed solvable. There was a crime scene. There were witnesses nearby. There was a suspicious object. There was blood evidence. There were people to interview. But 1975 was not the age of modern DNA. Police could collect evidence, but they could not yet unlock everything it held. And so began a search that would last 44 years. The first hours after a murder are critical. Every minute matters. Every footprint, every stain, every object left behind can become the difference between justice and a case that goes cold. Inside Debbie Tomlinson's apartment, investigators saw signs of a violent and terrifying struggle. The living room and kitchen appeared mostly normal. That mattered. If someone had broken in to steal, police would expect drawers pulled open, belongings scattered, valuables missing. But that was not what they found. The violence was concentrated in the bedroom. That was where Debbie had likely been attacked. That was where she had fought. The evidence suggested the killer used a blunt object and struck her repeatedly. Blood patterns showed the force of the assault. But the fatal act was strangulation. Debbie had also been restrained and gagged. The details were horrifying, but they told investigators something important. This was not sudden panic. This was controlled violence. The killer had come prepared, or he improvised quickly and deliberately. Police believed Debbie had been sexually assaulted. This shifted the direction of the investigation. The killer had not come for money. He had come for Debbie. That possibility made the city feel even more unsafe. Because if the motive was predatory, then anyone could be next. Investigators started building Debbie's final timeline. They knew she left her family home after Christmas and returned to her apartment on December 27th. They knew she called home at around 2:30 p.m. to say she had arrived safely. Another resident in the complex, who happened to be a police officer, remembered seeing Debbie return. He also remembered seeing her through the window, speaking on the phone. That detail confirmed she was alive and calm inside the apartment shortly before the attack. So the question became, was the killer already inside? Had he broken in while she was away for Christmas and waited? Had he watched her apartment knowing she would return? Or did he enter after she came back? The open window suggested entry or escape. The removed screen suggested someone had used it, but the exact sequence remained uncertain. Then there were the sunglasses. Witnesses soon came forward with a chilling detail. On the day Debbie was killed, people had seen a strange man near the apartment complex. He was described as white, in his 20s, thin or scrawny with dark hair. His hair was short on the sides, longer on top and combed back. He was wearing dark sunglasses, just like the pair found inside Debbie's apartment. The description mattered so much that police created a composite sketch and released it to the public. Someone had seen him, someone might know him, someone might recognize the face. But tips can be dangerous in a murder investigation. Some are useful, some are honest mistakes, some lead nowhere. Police followed what they could, but no arrest came. Then investigators turned toward Debbie's personal life. In many homicide cases, police first look at the people closest to the victim: partners, ex-partners, family, friends, anyone with jealousy, anger, resentment, obsession, or access. Debbie had an ex-boyfriend. Their relationship had reportedly been unstable, on and off over the years. By the time of the murder, they were no longer together. Still, police needed to examine him. He lived very close to Debbie. In fact, he lived across the street from her apartment. When questioned, he said he did not know Debbie lived there. Investigators found that difficult to believe, but suspicion is not proof. He also said he had been at work all day until around 5:30 p.m. Police checked. His alibi held. The ex-boyfriend was ruled out. The investigation moved on. But the city remained afraid. Grand Junction in 1975 had already seen violence. Some called it a year of fear. There were other attacks, other murders, and the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Police even considered whether Debbie's death could be connected to a serial offender. One name eventually came into the conversation: Ted Bundy. Bundy had connections to Colorado. He was later linked to the murder of Denise Oliverson in Grand Junction earlier that same year. Because Debbie was killed months later, investigators had to consider him. Could Ted Bundy have killed Debbie Tomlinson? At first, the possibility seemed terrifyingly plausible, but then police checked the dates. By late December 1975, Bundy was already in custody after being arrested in Utah in August. He could not have killed Debbie. That door closed, but another door opened, and behind it was someone much closer to home: Debbie's uncle. His name was Tim. He was on her father's side of the family. At first, he was interviewed like other relatives. That was normal. Police needed statements from everyone close to Debbie. But Tim's interview was not normal. He made comments that disturbed investigators. He spoke as though he and Debbie had been especially close. He suggested he knew a great deal about her private life. Then he mentioned details about the murder, details that police said had not been released publicly. He talked about Debbie being hit in the head. He talked about a bandana used to restrain her. And then he said something even more troubling. He said the bandana might have been his. He suggested Debbie may have borrowed it, or that he may have left it at her apartment earlier. To investigators, this was alarming. How did he know those details? Why was he placing one of his belongings at the scene? Was this nervous explanation? Was it guilt? Was it confusion? Then police asked him directly if he had killed Debbie. His response was strange enough to haunt the investigation for decades. He essentially said that if his blood or fingerprints were there, then maybe he had done it, but he could not remember. It was not a confession, but it was not a denial either. For detectives, Tim became the strongest person of interest. He had no solid alibi. He had made suspicious statements. He had inserted himself into the evidence. But there was one problem. There was no physical proof. In 1975, that meant everything. The police could suspect him. They could question him. They could watch him. But they could not prove he was the killer. And so Debbie's family was left in an impossible position. The man police suspected was one of their own. For Debbie's father, Jim, the pain was unbearable. His daughter was dead, and suspicion had fallen on his own brother. He did not know what to believe. He did not know whether to defend his family or fear it. The case did not end. It simply froze. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. And the question remained: who killed Debbie Tomlinson?
A cold case does not mean a case is forgotten. For the public, the headlines fade. For the police, files move into storage. But for the family, time does not move the same way. Every birthday comes back. Every Christmas comes back. Every ordinary day carries the same question: who did this? For Debbie Tomlinson's family, the years after 1975 were years without answers. The police had a prime suspect in mind: her uncle, Tim. But without physical evidence, they could not arrest him. They could not take the case to trial. They could not give the family certainty. And uncertainty is its own kind of punishment. It divides people. It creates doubt. It makes every family gathering painful. If Tim was innocent, then he had lived under suspicion for something monstrous. If he was guilty, then Debbie's killer had been close all along. The family had no way to know. The investigators had one piece of evidence that mattered more than they could fully understand at the time: blood. Most of the blood in Debbie's bedroom belonged to her, but one stain on the bedding did not. It came from an unknown male. In 1975, that was important but limited. Investigators could determine blood type and basic information, but they could not build the kind of DNA profile that modern detectives rely on today. Still, someone had made the right decision. The evidence was preserved. That single choice kept the case alive because science was changing. In the 1980s and 1990s, DNA analysis began transforming criminal investigations. Old cases, once thought impossible, began opening again. Evidence that had sat silent for decades suddenly had a voice. By around 2008, Debbie's case was reopened. 33 years had passed. Many people involved had aged. Memories had faded. Some witnesses were gone. But the evidence remained. And now police could test the unknown male blood from Debbie's bed. The first person they wanted to compare it to was obvious: Tim. For more than 3 decades, he had been the shadow over the case. The man police could not eliminate. The man whose strange comments had shaped the investigation. In late 2008, investigators brought Tim in again. They asked him for a DNA sample. At first, he hesitated. He said the investigation had caused him anxiety. He said he did not fully trust law enforcement. He was not sure he wanted to give them his DNA. To police, that hesitation felt suspicious. If he was innocent, why not clear his name? But hesitation is not guilt. People refuse or delay for many reasons: fear, anger, trauma, distrust, confusion. Eventually, Tim agreed. A sample was taken. The lab compared his DNA to the unknown male blood found on Debbie's bed. And then came the result. No match. Tim was not the killer. For 33 years, suspicion had followed him, and he was innocent. The result shocked investigators. It also changed the entire case. The old theory collapsed. The family's long nightmare shifted shape. Debbie had not been killed by the man police had suspected for decades. Her killer was someone else, someone who had escaped notice completely. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. If Debbie's killer had been convicted of a crime and had DNA in the system, there might be a match. But there was nothing. No hit, no name, no arrest. Once again, the case stalled. This is one of the cruelest parts of cold case work. Science can give investigators a profile, but not always a person. A DNA profile without a match is like a fingerprint from a ghost. You know the killer existed. You know he touched the crime scene. You know his body left evidence behind. But you still do not know his name. For Debbie's father, Jim, the waiting continued. But Jim did not let the case disappear. He kept calling. He kept asking. He kept pushing. He wanted to know whether new technology existed. He wanted to know whether anything more could be done. He refused to allow his daughter's name to become just another file in storage. By 2019, the world of forensic science had changed again. A new tool was helping solve old murders: forensic genetic genealogy. This method did not rely only on criminal databases. Instead, investigators could compare DNA to public genealogy databases, searching for distant relatives. From there, experts could build family trees, narrow possibilities, and identify suspects who had never been in CODIS. It was the same kind of technique that had helped identify the Golden State Killer in 2018. Now, Debbie's case had a new chance. The Grand Junction Police Department contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company known for forensic genealogy work. There was concern. The DNA was old. It had degraded over time. The sample had survived for decades. But would it be strong enough? Would it still speak? Scientists worked with what they had. They extracted what they could. And slowly, the unknown man from Debbie's apartment began to take shape. Not as a face, not yet, but as a family tree, a branch here, a distant relative there. Names connected to names. Generations traced backward and forward until finally investigators reached one man. A man who had never been a suspect. A man whose name had not appeared in Debbie's original case file. A man who had been hiding in plain history for 44 years. His name was Jimmy Dean Duncan. When investigators saw old photographs of Jimmy Dean Duncan, the past seemed to sharpen. He looked like the man witnesses had described in 1975. White, in his 20s, thin build, dark hair, short on the sides, longer on top, combed back. The resemblance to the composite sketch was hard to ignore. And then there were the sunglasses. The strange man seen near Debbie's apartment had been wearing dark sunglasses in the middle of winter. The sunglasses found inside Debbie's apartment may have belonged to him. For 44 years, that clue had waited. Now, for the first time, it seemed to have a face. Jimmy Dean Duncan was born in April 1949. He was around 26 years old when Debbie was killed. He was a Colorado native and had a criminal history. Reports described him as a career criminal involved in robberies and burglaries. He was not someone Debbie's case investigators had focused on in 1975. His name was not in the file. He had not been part of the original suspect circle. And yet, according to the DNA trail, he was the man they had been looking for. Detectives learned that Duncan had been in the Grand Junction area when Debbie was murdered. They also discovered something suspicious. Shortly after Debbie's death, he left Colorado. He went to Florida. There he continued committing crimes. One incident involved an attempted armed robbery at a bus depot. Duncan tried to steal money at gunpoint. Police arrived before he could escape. Because he was armed, officers fired at him. The gunshot left him paralyzed from the waist down. He was convicted of armed robbery and sent to prison in Florida. He served 6 years. Then, in December 1987, Jimmy Dean Duncan died. He was only 38. By the time investigators identified him in 2019, he had already been dead for more than 30 years. This created a painful truth. Debbie's killer had finally been named, but he could never be arrested. He could never be questioned. He could never stand trial. He could never explain why. Investigators still needed confirmation. Genealogy had pointed them toward Duncan, but they needed the strongest possible proof. Since Jimmy was dead, they went to a surviving close relative, his brother. His brother gave a DNA sample. The comparison came back as a near-exact familial match to the unknown male blood found on Debbie's bed. The conclusion was clear. Jimmy Dean Duncan was the man who killed Debbie Tomlinson. 44 years after her murder, the case finally had an answer. But it was not the answer anyone wanted. There would be no courtroom, no confession, no sentence. No moment where Debbie's family could look at the killer and demand to know why. Duncan had escaped justice in life. He had taken his secret to the grave. And that left investigators and the family with only a reconstructed possibility of what happened. Debbie may have had a distant, indirect connection to him. Her sister later said Debbie may have known of Duncan vaguely, because Debbie had gone to school with his sister, and they had sometimes gone horseback riding. But there was no evidence that Debbie and Jimmy were close. They were not known friends. They were not known partners. They were not part of each other's daily lives. That made the crime even more frightening. It suggested Duncan may have targeted Debbie from a distance. Perhaps he saw her near her apartment. Perhaps he knew she lived alone. Perhaps he had watched her before. Perhaps he entered while she was away for Christmas and waited. The evidence suggested he broke into the apartment through the window, possibly removing the screen to get inside. When Debbie returned, she called her family. She felt safe enough to talk normally. Then, after the call, everything changed. Duncan attacked her in her bedroom. She fought back. During the struggle, he was injured badly enough to leave his own blood on her bed. That single stain became the clue he could not erase. After killing Debbie, he moved her body to the bathroom and left her in the bathtub. Then he fled. The sunglasses stayed behind. So did the blood. He may have believed he had escaped completely, and for decades it looked like he had. He lived. He committed more crimes. He went to prison. He died. And Debbie's family kept waiting. That is the haunting part of this case. Duncan did not spend 44 years hiding from police. For most of that time, he was already dead. The truth was not being hidden by a living suspect. It was hidden by time, by old technology, by a name no one knew to ask about. For Debbie's mother, Dora, the answer came too late. She died in 2000, 19 years before the case was solved. She never learned who killed her daughter. Debbie's father, Jim, lived long enough to hear the name. After decades of pushing, calling, hoping, and waiting, he finally knew. He said the answer lifted a weight from his mind. He still did not know why, but at least he knew who. And sometimes, in a cold case, that is the only justice left. Not enough. Never enough. But something. There are cases where justice comes quickly. A suspect is found. Evidence is gathered. A trial happens. A sentence is given. Then there are cases like Debbie Tomlinson's. Cases where justice arrives late, incomplete, and painfully quiet. For 44 years, Debbie's family lived with a wound that never closed. They knew how she died. They knew where she died. They knew she had fought. But they did not know whose hands had taken her life. At first, suspicion focused on people close to her. Her ex-boyfriend was questioned and ruled out. Ted Bundy was considered and ruled out. Her uncle Tim remained under suspicion for decades, only for DNA to prove he was innocent. That part of the case is deeply tragic, because suspicion can destroy lives, even when it is wrong. Tim's strange statements made him look guilty. Investigators had reasons to question him, but the truth was elsewhere. The real killer was not the man everyone had been staring at. He was the stranger at the edge of the frame, the man in the sunglasses, Jimmy Dean Duncan, a criminal who passed through Debbie's life like a shadow and left devastation behind. When he killed Debbie, he likely believed the evidence he left would never matter. In 1975, he had reason to think that. DNA science was not ready. Genealogy databases did not exist. CODIS did not exist, but he made one mistake. He bled, and the blood remained. It waited through the 1970s, through the 1980s, through the 1990s, through the rise of DNA testing, through the birth of forensic genealogy. It waited until science became strong enough to read it. And when it finally did, it spoke one name, Jimmy Dean Duncan. But the truth came with cruelty. Duncan was already dead. There could be no punishment, no trial, no prison cell, no final confrontation, no answer to the most human question of all. Why? Why Debbie? Why that day? Why that apartment? Did he plan it? Did he stalk her? Did he know her schedule? Did he wait in the silence while she called home? Did he hear her tell her brother she loved him? Those questions may never be answered. And maybe that is why this case stays with people, because solving a case does not always heal it. Sometimes it only changes the shape of the grief. For Debbie's father, knowing the killer's name mattered. He had carried the case for decades. He had refused to let police forget his daughter. He had kept asking whether new technology could help. His persistence mattered. The preservation of evidence mattered. The work of investigators mattered. The advancement of forensic science mattered. And Debbie's life mattered. That is important to remember. True crime can sometimes become focused on the killer, his name, his crimes, his secrets. But Debbie Tomlinson was not just a victim in a cold case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, a young woman who loved horses and ranch life, a person who had just celebrated Christmas with her family, a person who called home to say she had arrived safely, a person whose final words to her brother were words of love. That is who she was before the crime. And that is who she should be remembered as. The apartment on Balfour Avenue became a crime scene, but before that, it was Debbie's first independent home, a place where she should have been safe, a place where she should have studied, laughed, rested, and planned her future. Jimmy Dean Duncan stole that future, but he did not erase her, because 44 years later, people still said her name. Debbie Tomlinson, the young woman from Colorado, the girl who loved horses, the sister who said, "I love you," before hanging up the phone, the daughter whose father never stopped fighting for answers. And in 2019, after decades of silence, the truth finally came. Not perfect justice, not full justice, but truth. The killer had a name, the shadow had a face, and the case that haunted Grand Junction for 44 years was finally solved.